So, let's set the stage. It's February 1815. A man who was once the master of Europe is now an exiled fugitive. But he's about to make one of the most unbelievable comebacks in history. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte's final, desperate gamble to reclaim everything he'd lost. And it all boils down to this single, heart-stopping moment. Just picture it. Napoleon, with his tiny force, is completely blocked by a royal regiment sent to capture him. So what does he do? He walks forward, throws open his coat, and basically dares them to shoot. It's pure political theater, and the fate of France is hanging in the balance. Okay, so how on earth did we get to that standoff? Well, we have to rewind a little, back to the tiny island of Elba. See, Napoleon was supposed to just rule this island and stay put. But come on, this is Napoleon. He was never going to just sit on the sidelines. He started hearing whispers that the new king in France was unpopular, and that old belief in his own destiny? Yeah, that never went away. He decided it was time to roll the dice one last time. So under the cover of darkness, he slips away from Elba with just a handful of ships. And you gotta understand, he's not sailing as a conqueror this time. He's an outlaw. The great powers of Europe had written him off, but Napoleon was determined to write his own ending, even if it meant dragging the whole continent back into war. You know, the craziest part is how this whole thing almost ended before it even really started. Just a day out from Elba, his little ship passes right by a French Royal Navy brig, the Zephyr. They're literally within shouting distance. But for whatever reason, they just sail on by, no questions asked. Maybe, just maybe, Napoleon's famous lucky star was still looking out for him. Now, to avoid the king's armies, Napoleon takes this scenic route, right through the French Alps in winter. And this shows you just how much had changed. He's 45 years old now, and the reports say he's stumbling on the ice, needing help from his men. This grueling 190-mile march in 6 days, it's a far cry from the unstoppable general who crossed these same mountains years before. But as he pushes north, something truly incredible begins to happen. This isn't really a military campaign at all. It's a conquest of charisma. Napoleon is about to win back his empire using nothing but his reputation and the power of his personality. And this is the first real test. Outside the city of Grenoble, his path is blocked by the king's 5th Regiment. Now, a lot of these guys are veterans. They served under him. A tense standoff begins. His men are yelling, begging them to join, but the royalist officers are holding the line. And that's when Napoleon makes that incredible move we talked about. After he challenges them to shoot him, a royalist captain actually orders his men to fire. But nothing. Just silence. And then, a few shouts of "Long live the Emperor" turn into a roar. The entire regiment switches sides on the spot. As Napoleon himself later said, that was the moment he stopped being an adventurer and became a ruler again. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the king isn't sweating it yet. He's counting on Napoleon's own legendary marshals to stop him. And one of them, Marshal Ney, a man Napoleon himself called the bravest of the brave, is especially fired up. He actually promises the king he'll bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. But Ney finds himself in a totally impossible spot. Napoleon writes him a personal letter reminding him of their shared glory. At the same time, Ney can see that the king's authority is just crumbling. Regiments are defecting left and right, and his own soldiers are starting to mutter. The last thing he wants is to be the one to start a bloody French civil war. So Ney makes his decision. In a jaw-dropping reversal, he declares his loyalty to Napoleon in front of his entire army. That was it. That was the final nail in the coffin for the royalist cause. A few days later, King Louis XVIII flees Paris, and Napoleon walks right back into the palace. He had reconquered France without a single shot being fired. But while Napoleon was celebrating in Paris, the rest of Europe was reacting with incredible speed. The party was officially over. The great powers, who'd been arguing with each other for months, were about to unite like never before. All the bigwigs, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, they were all at the Congress of Vienna, trying to carve up the new map of Europe, and they were literally on the verge of going to war with each other. But then the news arrives. Napoleon's back! And just like that, all their fighting stopped. Instantly, they had a common enemy once again. And they do something absolutely unheard of. They form a new coalition, the 7th one, and they declare war not on the country of France, but on one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. They officially label him an outlaw, an enemy and disturber of the world. This was no longer about nations, this was personal. Napoleon scrambled to raise an army. And thousands of his old veterans did come flocking back to him, which was great, but it just wasn't the same. France was tired, just completely exhausted from decades of war. He could scrape together about 200,000 men. Now get ready for this. Look at what he was facing. The coalition's plan was to mobilize almost 1 million soldiers from all across Europe. The numbers are just mind-boggling. He wasn't just fighting a few armies, he was taking on an entire continent.
And as if those odds weren't bad enough, Napoleon had another huge problem, a much more personal one. His legendary marshals, the men who had been with him from the beginning, his band of brothers, they were gone.
I mean, just look at the breakdown. It's grim. Out of his original 26 marshals, almost none of them were available. Some were dead, some had switched sides, and a whole bunch of them just decided to stay home. He was about to fight the battle of his life without his A-team. Probably the biggest loss of all was Marshal Berthier. For 20 years, he was Napoleon's chief of staff. Think of him as the guy who could translate Napoleon's genius into actual clear orders that an army could follow. He was essential. But he'd left with the king and then died mysteriously just before the campaign started. It was a crippling blow.
And on top of everything else, Napoleon himself just wasn't the man he once was. People who saw him at the time said his work seemed labored, that he got tired really easily. The endless years of war and stress had finally started to catch up with him.
So let's recap. He's massively outnumbered, he's got a crisis in his command structure, and his own health is failing. Napoleon knew he had one and only one shot at this. He had to move, and he had to move fast. It was time for that one final desperate roll of the dice. His plan was as simple as it was brutal. He couldn't afford to sit around and wait for 1 million men to show up on his doorstep. So the idea was a lightning-fast strike into Belgium. He'd hit the closest armies, the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher, and try to beat them one at a time before they could team up. He was hoping a shocking, decisive victory would make the whole coalition fall apart. And ever the believer in signs and his own destiny, Napoleon chose June 14th to launch his attack. Why? Because it was the anniversary of 2 of his most brilliant victories. He was betting everything not just on his plan, but on that unshakable belief that he was destined to win.
And that's where we'll leave things, right on the eve of the Waterloo campaign. So you have to ask yourself, when you look at everything he was up against, a tired army, no commanders, and literally the rest of the world lining up to take him down, was this final gamble an act of pure genius, or was it just the last desperate move of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose?